This is Mrs. Palmer Quay with the first video for Advanced Biology. In this video, I'm going to go over some of the introductory topics that get you all set up and ready to study anatomy and physiology. First of all, what is anatomy and physiology? Well, these words refer to two related things. Anatomy refers to the structure of body parts, and physiology refers to the function or how they work. Because we will see over and over again that the form of something follows the function that is required of that particular body part. And so there's a very close connection between how we're put together and what we are then asking our bodies to do. In talking about human anatomy and physiology, sometimes I'm going to bring in comparative anatomy, or how the anatomy and physiology of an animal compares to humans. Especially I draw upon some of my farm animals, because this can help us understand what's going on inside our body by comparing it to how something else which works in a slightly different way, or some other animal that works in a different way. Also, we will talk about pathophysiology, disease states, things when function is breaking down, to help us understand what function is normally. And in reality, it's pathophysiology that has helped researchers understand the body, because when seeing how something doesn't work right often helps us understand what's going on sort of hidden and invisibly when it actually functions the way it's supposed to. As we get going into this course, we've got to get some key terms and concepts down right away so that you can start applying all that information that you're going to be inundated with as we move into body systems. And so first we need to talk about anatomical position. We have a standard position when we're talking about the human body, so that when everything is oriented the same way. So this little picture here shows a person in anatomical position. They are facing forward, standing upright, and you notice that the arms are turned so that the thumb is pointing to the outside and the palms are facing forward. This position is important because it tells you then that the front of the leg is at the knee, but the front of the arm is at this bendy part of the elbow. It's what we might call the inside of the arm. But both of those in anatomical position would be the front of the body. You have a lot of anatomical regions that you need to memorize. Places on the body, words that refer to specific areas. Some of these you may already know. You might have heard of a cervical collar from someone who's been in a car accident and has suffered whiplash. They wear a cervical collar around their neck. The cervical region is the neck region. Or with the advent of computers everywhere, carpal tunnel syndrome is a disease state or a disorder state that many people have experienced. And you see that carpal means wrist, and so that's where the name came from. As you look through these lists of anatomical regions, hopefully some of these will be ones you already are familiar with. I think you can think oral, of course that means mouth, nasal means nose. But you may have to memorize some of these other ones it'll be the first time that you've ever seen them. So work on these anatomical regions. There are flashcards that I'll be sending you a link that will help you learn these. We will be tested on these regions, and we will use them all the time in talking about what's going on in the body. You also need to know body planes. This is how we slice up the body. And with many of the scanning machines that we have nowadays, things are sliced, can be sliced in several directions. There are three major directional slices. The first plane is the frontal plane, and we see this one here going through the body, and you can see that this divides a body into a front and back section, and so that one's easy to remember because the word frontal is in the description. Along with front to back, another slice is one that would divide something into a right and left side. That is a sagittal plane, and if it goes directly through the middle or the medial section of the body, it's known as a median or a mid-sagittal plane. So here's a sagittal plane here, so it would be slicing right down the middle. If this slice is more to the side, then it would be called a parasagittal plane. And then the third plane is a transverse plane, which then divides the body into a top and bottom. And these planes don't always go through the middle of the trunk or torso the way you see here. As I said, we already have the parasagittal plane I talked about. With our scanning functions, you can get many slices going down right next to each other, and then a CT scan or an MRI shows those tiny little pieces of the body. The planes are helpful when we're talking about how organs are positioned relative to each other, because it gives us just this slice, this little piece of the body with everything lined up the way that it is functioning when it's held in the body in normal states. When you're slicing something like a bone, a cylindrical structure, so we'll just take a piece of a bone here, then we use words that are very similar. Instead of transverse, sometimes they talk about cross-sectional, and instead of sagittal, we talk about longitudinal, and then when it's a sideways slice at an angle, it becomes an oblique plane. So you'll see those terms again when we get to the skeletal system. I just wanted to introduce them now. So along with anatomical position and the planes of the body, you also need, and the regions of the body, you need to know the directions, because sometimes we're talking about one body part or body organ in reference to another one, and so there are these positional terms that are more directional in nature. I hope you remember the words ventral and dorsal from biology class. We use those to talk about the front and the back of the body. At least you should know dorsal fins in sharks. Two other words that refer to front and back are anterior and posterior. And as I said, these are directional terms. So you use that to say, for example, the nose is more anterior than the ear. It is more towards the front. Its position is anterior to the ear. It is in front of the ear, more towards the front of the body. So the directional terms come in pairs because they're talking about one being positioned in reference to the other, and you can say that the ear is more posterior than the nose, so that you want to be able to, you see them as pairs, you can go either way in describing the first item or the second item as the kind of the subject of the sentence. Other directional terms you need to know are superior, which means more on top, then inferior, which is more towards the bottom. These are not value judgments, something is superior or inferior or better than the other, but it's just above or below. Proximal refers to something that's close to the point of attachment. So if you think about the P in proximal and the P in point of attachment, so that the thigh here is proximal to the hip, this point of attachment, but the ankle and down here is much more distal, so that it's much further away from that point of attachment of the leg. The middle part is the medial part, so anything that's more close to the middle is more medial. Things that are moving towards the outer part of the body are more lateral. And so you see these directional terms both in describing one body part in relation to another, but also just in names, so that you have a lateral muscle or a proximal or distal tubule in the kidneys. You will see these coming up. Trying these directional terms are just helping you place something in the body. So it's another bunch of things to memorize. You also need to know that the body is made up of cavities. Your arms and your legs are pretty solid, but there is a dorsal cavity that contains certain organs and a ventral cavity that contains other organs, and they're not quite as tightly packed as your arms and your legs. The dorsal cavity contains your brain and your spinal cord, and it is one continuous cavity, and the whole thing has a circulation of cerebral spinal fluid that is constantly moving from the top of your head to the bottom of your spinal cord. That's why doctors can take a spinal tap, take a little bit of the fluid out from down here on the tailbone, and determine whether you've got bacteria up here in the brain, because any dead bacteria will also be found in the cerebral spinal fluid. And so the dorsal cavity towards the back of the body contains the organs of the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. The ventral cavity towards the front of the body actually has a small division here with the diaphragm, which then subdivides this ventral cavity into the thoracic cavity, where you can find your heart and your lungs and your esophagus and your aorta and other various organs. and the abdominal cavity, where you've got all the rest of your digestive system, stomach and liver and intestines and all. And even though there's not a membrane, sometimes in talking about sections we talk about the pelvic cavity as if it is something separate, or the abdominal pelvic cavity, because that's referring to the region of the ventral cavity that's down here surrounded by the bones of the pelvis. And so that would be the place that you'd find the reproductive system, the female internal reproductive system, and the urinary system. So you need to be able to place the right organs in the right cavity, and just to realize that we have sort of these big spaces inside of us that have a outer edge, and then lots of things filled in inside. As we're talking about anatomy and physiology, most of our discussion is going to be happening on the organ system and individual organs and tissue level, but these first couple units are all dealing with the very, very small levels of organization, starting with the various parts of an atom, which then come together to form an atom, which then form a molecule that looks like water, which can be all bonded together in a large macromolecule, one of these many organic molecules that make us up, that provide the building blocks for organelles. There's a nice mitochondrion, which are found in cells, and we'll be talking a lot about different cells in the body and how they specifically contribute to the anatomical functions and of our structure of our body. And then different cells come together to form tissues. Several kinds of tissues make an organ. Organs are organized into organ systems, and the organ systems then all together contribute to the organism. And so as we're working through anatomy and physiology, we will be working in these different levels, but primarily we are found over on this side with the organ systems. You just need to have a general idea what goes on in each of these systems in this first unit, because we, of course, will be spending lots of time talking about the systems themselves individually. But just take time to read an overview, think about, what organs are found in the skeletal system, what does it do for us, what about the nervous system. Just some general introductory knowledge is all that's needed in this first unit. The other thing that's very important as we start off anatomy and physiology is just to review the functions that are found in a living organism. What are some of those key characteristics of life? Well, something that is alive is growing. It can be growing in size, or if it's a multicellular organ, it can be growing in the number of cells. And of course, we are multicellular organisms. Something that is alive is able to repair so that life can continue. And so there are processes that will extract energy from the environment and absorb it to where it is needed and get rid of the stuff that are not needed. So all of these things are characteristic of life. Something that's alive can respond. It can sense something going on in the environment and react to it. There's movement going on internally within cells and externally by the organism itself. And of course, organisms are reproducing. That's one of those key characteristics of life. Then the final topic for this introductory section, which is something I hope you remember for biology, is homeostasis. Remember, homeostasis refers to the fact that organisms exist in a state of balance, that we actually have a very small tolerance for being too hot or too cold or too salty or too acidy. And so our body systems work to keep us perfectly balanced. Homeostasis is maintained by systems that have three components. There is something that senses how things are, and sometimes that's referred to as the receptor. There is a part of the body that is in control of the response, and sometimes that's referred to as a set point. And then there is a responder, something that happens if a response is needed because the sensor is telling the control center that something's not quite right. Effector is another word that we sometimes see, and so that when something is out of balance, it is sensed, the message is sent to the control center, and if needed, a response comes to put things back in balance. There are two feedback loops that are part of homeostasis. by far, most of them are negative feedback loops. Negative feedback loops, the general characteristic is that if something is too high, the body works to bring it down so that the sensing and the response are in opposite directions. And that is essential because then as this gets smaller, the response gets smaller and it'll eventually shut itself off. To just go through this chart gives you a general pattern for something in a negative feedback loop. So there's some variable that is being sensed, generally by your nervous system, and so your nervous system detects a change. It detects that it has moved into an imbalance situation. Something is too high. There's too much acid floating around in your blood, so that sensor sends information along a pathway to the control center, generally in your brain, and it has a response hardwired in that if this sensor information comes in, this output goes along to the effector saying, make this change. There's too much acid in the blood, increase your breathing rate to get rid of it. And so the response then will affect your state of balance by tipping it the other way, bringing it back closer to the way it should be, and so that it returns it to the proper state of homeostasis. In a few cases, we have a positive feedback loop in the body. We're very familiar with positive feedback when we're dealing with people psychologically. You know, if you want somebody does a good job and you want to encourage them, you let them know they've done a good job, and then they're probably more likely to continue to do a good job because that's a positive feedback loop. In the body, a positive feedback loop can cascade into a huge problem, and so there's only a few. Childbirth is one that is a positive feedback. Childbirth labor is stimulated by the head of the baby pushing against the cervix. As it pushes against the cervix, it sends nerve impulses to the brain. The brain releases or stimulates the pituitary gland to release oxytocin. Oxytocin stimulates the uterus to contract, which then will push the head of the baby against the cervix harder, which will send more nerve information to the brain because it's being stimulated, which will make more oxytocin, which will push the child against the cervix even harder. So you can see how it is a positive feedback loop. It just keeps on going around and around and accelerating until this baby is born. Then the head is through the cervix. There's no more pushing on it. Then you don't have the nerve impulses anymore. And this step stops and the positive feedback loop is broken. Blood clotting is another situation in the body that's a positive feedback loop. Any of the positive feedback loops in our human body, when functioning normally, will have some way to shut off, some way that the initial stimulus will stop, because otherwise there's no way to turn them off if they just continually wrap around. But as I said, most of our feedback loops for homeostasis are negative because as we get a response and things start going back to normal, there's less of a stimulus. In a positive feedback loop, you get more of a stimulus as time goes on. So there's your first video for this very first unit. For this course, you will have to study. There's no way around it, but I hope that the particular setup that I'm using with the learning targets and the feedback with class discussion and such will help you get this in your brain a little bit more easily as we start to apply it and try to look for connections with what you already know. See you in class.